Genesis chapter 37. As Pastor said, we're rounding out our study or Old Testament survey. We kind of started the first half looking at an actual overview of the books in the Old Testament, and the last half here we've been looking at characters throughout the Old Testament and seeing how God worked in individuals' lives and how we can look back at the example they set for us today so that we can learn and live our lives for Christ better, right? Now, the Old Testament although written to the Jews, is not solely for the Jews. And I think that's extremely important for us to remember as Christians. God's given us every word in the Bible for our learning, our instruction, our encouragement, and our correction. And today, there's a lot of characters we could have looked at to finish up our study. We could have looked at Moses. We could have looked at David, one of my favorite Old Testament characters. We could have looked at Job. But today we're going to look at a man named Joseph. A man named Joseph, and the lesson is all about doing right. And I don't think there's any better way to finish looking at the Old Testament than to just focus on, hey, every bit of the Old Testament was given to help encourage us to do right, obey God, no matter the circumstance. And Joseph is the living example, is the epitome of somebody who decided, no matter my circumstance, I'm going to do right. Joseph is one of the great characters found in the Old Testament. If we were to examine his background, we might assume, and very interestingly, think that there is no way he could ever amount to much, and here's why. He grew up in a home that was a mess. He lost both his mother and his grandfather in death at a young age. His half-sister was raped. His father had 13 children by 4 different women. His oldest half-brother committed immorality with his father's concubine. There was continual strife of various women vying for the attention and affection of his father, along with the jockeying among his brothers and half-brothers for position and favor with their father. But despite it all, Joseph emerges as a man of great character and courage characterized by grace and goodness. You can overcome your environment, any one of us, any Christian, we can overcome our environment if we choose to follow God. A lot of the time, it can seem that our environment dictates, and in fact, our culture tells us today that the environment you live in, the environment you grow up in, the people you're around will dictate, this is what they say, will dictate your actions. But the fact of the matter is that as a Christian, if you know today that when you die, you'll go to heaven, if that's you, that does not dictate your actions. That does not dictate your future. We are no longer slaves to sin and our sin nature. We are more than conquerors through him that loves us. That's Romans 8:37. And we do not have to be products of what's around us. Joseph is proof and an example to us of what we can do if we're determined to obey and please God above our environment and above our circumstances. So let's start in Genesis 37, verse 12. We're going to read 12 verses here, so 12 through 24. Genesis chapter 37, starting in verse 12. God's word says here, "And his brethren went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said unto Joseph, Do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send thee unto them. And he said to him, Here am I." Verse 14, "And he said to him, Go, I pray thee, see whether it be well with thy brothers and well with the flocks, and bring me word again. So he sent him out of the vale of Hebron, and he came to Shechem." Verse 15, "And a certain man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field." I think that's a hilarious sentence right there. He was wandering in the field. "And the man asked him, saying, What seekest thou?" This lost teenager. "And he said, I seek my brethren. Tell me, I pray thee, where they feed their flocks. And the man said, They are departed hence. For I heard them say, Let us go to Dothan. And Joseph went after his brethren and found them in Dothan. And when they saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. And they said one to another, Behold, this dreamer cometh. Come now, therefore, and let us slay him, and cast him into some pit. And we will say, Some evil beast hath devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. They're a little bitter. And Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands, and said, Let us not kill him. And Reuben said unto them, Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness. Lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands, to deliver him to his father again. And it came to pass, when Joseph was come unto his brethren, that they stripped Joseph of his coat of many colors that was on him. Verse 24, And they took him and cast him into a pit. And the pit was empty. There was no water in it. There's two things I want to notice from this part. See, Joseph, we're going to look at 4 parts of Joseph's life. We're going to start with Joseph in the pit and how he decided to do right regardless of his circumstances. Joseph in the pit was a product of his own family, of the actions in his own family. And Joseph's circumstances and his background were, although very, the odds are stacked against him essentially for doing right. But, and on top of all of that, excuse me, I'm having trouble speaking this morning. Joseph was his father's favorite, right? And that adds more issues to everything. His brothers were jealous, and on top of that, Joseph had dreams that he said were going to happen, prophecies of the future, and his brothers became bitter against him because of that, because their father at least humored him. He still had, even in spite of all that, he still had the responsibility to both work and obey his father, which he did willingly. And this caused jealousy and ill will towards Joseph among his brothers. When his brothers saw him coming, they immediately began to plan his death. And if it wasn't for Reuben, who stopped them from going as far as killing him, Joseph would have died that day. Think about that. His own brothers, his own half-brothers, desiring to kill him. Not friends, not even cordial, just hate him. Joseph found himself in a life-threatening problem because of his own family. And all of us can experience difficulty because of the actions of family members. Could be a brother or a sister, could be a father or a mother, a son or a daughter, or an uncle or an aunt. Well, let me tell you, it doesn't matter the issue, it doesn't matter the person. We still have an obligation to obey God, 1, and 2, to do right by those around us. God does not give us an exception. He says, love the Lord thy God. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like unto it, love thy neighbor as thyself. He didn't say except for the cousin that makes your life absolutely miserable. He didn't say that. He didn't say except for the brother that triggers you every time he enters the room. There are no exceptions. And Joseph here, we get to see, we don't find a single mention of Joseph retaliating or lashing out on his brothers in anger over their own wickedness. What they did was absolutely wrong. And in the eyes of man, we would see him as justified to lash out at them, to retaliate, to find some way to get back at them. In the eyes of man, not the eyes of God, in the eyes of man, it would be acceptable, quote unquote. But in the eyes of God, it's never right to do wrong. Therefore, and what is such a blessing about Joseph and his life, even when he was in the pit, even when he was at one of the lowest parts in his life, we see a young man, a teenager, willing to do right, just trying to obey his father, and not willing to retaliate against those around him. Family members may let us down, just as they did Joseph. That's never an excuse for us to respond wrongly. Turn over to Genesis chapter 39. We go from Joseph in the pit to Joseph in peril. After Joseph was cast into a pit, he was sold into slavery. He was bought in Egypt by a man named Potiphar. The life of a slave was not easy, nor was it pleasant, and it's never been easy or pleasant. But I found this pretty interesting. In Psalm 105, verse 17 and 18, it says, He sent a man before them, even Joseph, who was sold for a servant, whose feet they hurt with fetters. He was laid in iron. Joseph's life, from this point on, was an absolute horror. Imagine that. I'm like, when I think about this, I think of my own brothers and what it would be like if I were to have them take me, throw me into a ditch that I can't get out of until some slave trader comes along and they sell me for a bag of gold and silver, and I go to a land, to a country, to a city I've never been, never seen, probably barely heard of, and I'm sold to a man, clapped in iron, and forced to work. And not for a wage, not for my family, to work for somebody else's gain in an environment that is, it's just horrible. In spite of all that, look at verse 1, Genesis 39. Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. In spite of Joseph's situation, what we'll be able to see is that he worked hard and didn't shirk his work because of how he got into that situation. By all rights, he was in his situation because of the actions of wicked men. He was in his situation because somebody else decided they were going to do wrong, and now he's suffering for it. But Joseph faithfully and continually did right. Look at verse 9. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I skipped down quite a bit. Look at verse 4 in Genesis 39. And Joseph found grace in his sight, talking about Potiphar, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house and all that he had put into his hand. That's amazing right there. Joseph could have decided, you know what? I was sold by my brothers. I'm going to make the people that bought me suffer. I'm going to do the least amount of work so they don't get their money's worth. That's what a vindictive, un-Christ-honoring heart will want to say. How can I honor God in this kind of situation? I mean, he's a literal slave. I'm trying to put myself in Joseph's shoes. I've been sold into slavery. I'm now in a land called Egypt, working for a guy named Potiphar. I've been sold by two people now. Why should I work hard? How is there honor and glory given to God through this situation? Well, you know what? Obedience. In Philemon, we see that we're supposed to obey those that are over us. We're supposed to obey our rulers. It didn't say as long as it's a good situation, as long as you applied for the job. It didn't say that. We're supposed to obey those that have the rule over us, and Joseph took that to heart. He was willing to obey and work hard, not necessarily for his own sake, but I believe for the sake of his God. And we'll get to see that much more throughout his life as he develops and as he grows more. And what's interesting is in this moment of peril, everything seems to be going fantastic in his life. He worked hard, didn't shirk, did his best, and God was blessing him. Potiphar was recognizing his work and put him in charge of everything in his house. In fact, everything under Potiphar's hand, except his wife, was in Joseph's power. Everything was going great for a slave. Until Potiphar's wife, who had sin in her heart, came along, things became difficult again for him. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce Joseph. Instead of going along with her, Joseph recognized and rightly called out the sin that was not only wrong, but against God himself. Look at verse 9 in Genesis 39. This is Joseph's response to Potiphar's wife. He said, "There is none greater in this house than I. Look at the position that I've earned. Neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee. Potiphar gave me all of this, and you're his wife. Because thou art his wife, how then can I do this great wickedness?" He could have stopped right there. But he said, and sin against God. See, the most important thing to him wasn't necessarily trying to do right. I think the most important thing to him was pleasing God. In spite of his circumstance, see, this is his boss's wife, and it's not like a regular boss at work where you're hired, you can quit and get another job. That's not the kind of thing that he was in. He was in a situation where he was there regardless of whether he liked it or not. And he could be in a lot of trouble if he didn't obey Potiphar's wife. In spite of all that, he said, no, what you're asking to do, what you want to do is absolutely wrong. And it's not just wrong, it's against my God. He lives in a land of Egypt, a place of many gods. They have a god for the sun. They have a god for the grass. They have a god for the river. They literally have a god or goddess for everything. And he said, my God, the only God that matters, would not be happy with this. It was because of this that Potiphar's wife tried to force Joseph into sin and then accused him of rape because he had refused to go along with her. Joseph's integrity caused him to suffer in prison wrongly. Think about that. Because he decided to do right, he's in prison. Not just prison, but prison for slaves. It may be because that someone hears you were determined to do right, or you're faced with a situation to choose right or wrong, but if you choose right or you have chosen right, you're suffering because of it, or you may suffer because of it. Let me tell you, Joseph is a testament and an example for us that if we'll choose to do right, God will be with us for every step of that path. God said that his word is a lamp unto our path and a light unto our feet. That means if we choose to do right, if we choose to obey God's word, every step that we take, every right decision that we make, it doesn't matter if it's going to cause us some problems here on earth. At the end of the day, God's still going to show us the next step we need to take. At the end of the day, it's still the right thing to do. It's still obedience. See, Joseph in peril didn't choose the easy path. He decided to choose what was right in the eyes of God. We must do right, even in our own power. We must do right, even when faced with a decision that we know or we're pretty sure is going to bring us negative consequences. We must choose to do right. So we see him in the pit, we see him in peril, and now we're going to see him in prison. Look at verse 21 in Genesis 39. I know we're going fast throughout his life, but we're running out of time. Verse 21 says, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. A slave made a prisoner in a slave's prison was given charge of all the slaves in prison. That's crazy. You think about that. I've never heard of a slave being given charge of everything in a prison. A prisoner, nonetheless. I've never heard of a prisoner being given charge of everything in a prison. And yet, that's what God's doing for Joseph. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. He was serving. He was working. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand because the Lord was with him. In that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. In spite of Joseph's situation and plight, he continued to honor God and do right. He worked hard where he was at. And because of this, God showed mercy, it says, and gave him a place of leadership in the most unlikely of places. If I were to go to prison, I don't think I would be like, all right, how can I get to the top of this food chain quick? By serving. I don't think that's going to be my first thought. And yet Joseph served, he obeyed, he did right so much that the keeper of the prison, the head honcho of this place, decided, Joseph, you're in charge of everything. The Bible says that he didn't even know what Joseph was doing because he trusted him so much. was in this prison that a butler and a baker of the Pharaoh, a couple verses down, we won't be able to look at everything, sadly, we're running out of time, but there was a butler and a baker of Pharaoh's palace that were admitted, and after a while, Joseph noticed that they were exceptionally sad, apparently even for prisoners. Joseph asked them what was bothering them, and after they conversed and discussed their dreams that they had, God gave Joseph the meaning of their dreams. One was to be restored as Pharaoh's servant, and the other was to be executed. This gave hope and joy to the butler who received the interpretation. And Joseph requested of this man, when he was let out of prison, to remember him and speak to the Pharaoh on his behalf due to his circumstances. It's like, hey, even though Joseph in prison is in a pretty decent spot, he doesn't want to be in prison, and I don't blame him. It's like, hey, can you talk to Pharaoh for me? Explain the situation. You know I'm being genuine. You know I'm being honest. You can see that my work here, it's living proof. Can you speak to the Pharaoh for me? And yet, when the day came, Joseph was left and forgotten for 2 whole years. It's possible that any one of us here could find ourselves trapped in a place we don't want to be in. Maybe it's a living situation. Maybe it's a job. Maybe it's education. Maybe it's relationships. But I guarantee you, whatever your situation is, whatever the problem that we're stuck in, you know you can't get out of it unless God intervenes. We'll wait on God and we'll depend on Him and do right while we are waiting. God will open up doors. It may not happen soon. It took 2 years for Joseph to get out of there. It may not happen now, but if we'll do right and we'll wait on God, He will open the door for us to get to a better place. We have to trust God with our now and our future. So we see Joseph in the pit. He was in peril, in prison. And then in chapter 41, if you go over there for me, in Genesis 41, we'll see Joseph in the palace. Joseph had gone from hated and persecuted by his family, made a slave, falsely accused of wickedness, and forgotten by the man he gave hope. It seemed like it was just one thing after the other, but regardless, Joseph kept working and striving to honor God. It was because of this that we see in Genesis 41, God giving Pharaoh a dream that disturbed him so much he required an interpretation. It was through this that God brought Joseph to light and exalted him far above everything he had ever done. The butler told the Pharaoh, saying, hey, there's this guy who interpreted a dream for me accurately. That's why I'm here today. He told me all this was going to happen before it did. He's reliable. You can talk to him. The Pharaoh sends for Joseph. He tells Joseph the dream. Joseph interprets the dream. And then let's look at verse 37, 41. At the end of Joseph interpreting the dream for him, he said, set a man who's going to keep track of everything. We have 7 years to steward, 7 years of prosperity, and we need to keep track. We need to save up, essentially, and prepare for 7 years of famine, of very, very bad times. In verse 37, and the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? Verse 39, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, bow the knee, and he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh, verse 44, said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Joseph went through a lot of garbage in his life, not because he did wrong, because he did right. And in spite of all of that, God blessed and raised him up. The Bible says that he raises man up and puts man down. Promotion cometh from above. And because Joseph was willing to do right in all of his difficult circumstances, regardless of whether it was caused by his family, caused because of somebody lying, regardless of whether it was a situation he was stuck in, God exalted Joseph to the palace. So much so that everything the Pharaoh had under his rule was now under Joseph's rule. And he said, the only place I'll be greater than you, Joseph, is on the throne. That's pretty big. All of that happened because of God. And all of that happened because Joseph decided, I'm going to do right now. I'm going to be pleasing to God now. I'm not going to make the move that makes sense for my career. I'm not going to make the move that makes my situation easier. I'm not going to complain and gripe and make everybody else around me miserable because I'm wrongly here, which is true. He shouldn't have been there by all means. But he decided to do right. And for us Christians, and if you can only be a Christian if you've trusted Jesus Christ as your Savior, and I invite you, if you don't know where you're going when you die today, if you don't know where you're going, it's time to get that settled. It can't be you can't get to heaven by going to church. You can't get to heaven by being a good person. It's for by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Hey, we're sinners in the hands of an angry God. We can't think and give ourselves a false security saying, I'm going to heaven because I am who I am, because I live a pretty good life. It's not how it is. If we did one sin in our entire life, we would face judgment in the eyes of a just God. But we have to accept that gift that came through Jesus Christ dying on the cross. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Because God sent Christ to live a perfect life here on earth and die a perfect death and raise again from the dead. Because he did that, we have entrance into heaven. But you have to accept that gift for yourself. It's automatically offered, but it's not automatically accepted. We have to accept it by going to God and admitting I'm a sinner, believing that Jesus Christ is who he said he was, the God in flesh, the Son of God who did rise again from the dead. If he didn't rise again from the dead, we all here are talking about nothing. Jesus Christ did rise again from the dead. We believe that, and then we ask him, hey, I accept your gift. Can you please take me to heaven when I die? That's how you can know for sure you're going to heaven. And if you don't know, please make that decision today. But for the Christian, let's make a decision to be like Joseph. Let's make a decision that, hey, my situation's not ideal, my position is not great, but I'm going to do right. I'm going to do right even though everything around me screams the opposite. Let's do right. Let's honor God. We'll be back here in 9 minutes for the main service.